All right, everybody. We are going to go ahead and get started. We are so excited to see such a big crowd today. My name is Lauren. I am a third-year medical student at the University of Florida, currently working to get my MD and also my Master in Public Health. We have a pretty exciting day planned for this afternoon session. Our objective of the session is really this kind of central theme that climate change is negatively impacting domestic and global health, but some communities are disproportionately affected. And so some of our goals of this session are to really kind of provide an overview of some of those foundational concepts of climate change and the green movement. What do we mean when we're using these terms and kind of referring to? We want to talk about how climate change has inequitable consequences in both the United States as well as internationally, with a particular focus on Africa. We want to talk about the carbon footprint of clinical practices and kind of the medical field in general, and maybe talk about some ways and some very tangible things that you can do if you're a practice administrator or a healthcare provider or work in another field, how you can make your institution a little more green friendly. We want to talk about the impact and importance of educational and advocacy initiatives. And so that's going to be kind of this educational piece where we have some experts that are going to be sharing their experience and knowledge on these topics. But what we really don't want this to be is a long lecture. We want to hear from you, the audience. We want to know what questions you have, and we would love for you to walk away from the session with some very tangible action steps that you can take to begin implementing some things in your institutions, in your policies, in your communities, to actually see some impact and change in regards to climate change. So part of that's going to be kind of having a large group discussion after we hear from our experts, as well as kind of brainstorming together how we can all get involved. So again, at the end of the day, we want to empower each audience member today to begin promoting green policies and initiatives in their own institutions. A couple of housekeeping things. So this is a Zoom webinar. We do have the chat box open, and so we'll be kind of monitoring the chat box throughout the session. So if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. We're going to have opportunities throughout to ask questions, and also at the end. There's also going to be a few poll everywhere softwares that we're going to be using, and I'll go through that in a second. But feel free to use the chat box for those questions. In addition, please just make sure that you are muted, and if there's too much noise, we'll be able to mute you on your behalf, but just kind of be cognizant of any extraneous noise around you, and we'll primarily use the chat box to ask questions until we get to our discussion, just because there are so many of us. And I think that's it for housekeeping. So we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So this is a quick breakdown of our agenda. This session is slated for 3 hours. We're probably not going to take the full 3 hours. So we're going to, keep the discussion going. We have this time, but of course, I feel like people are never a little sad if they have a few extra minutes for lunch or to grab some coffee. So this will be kind of the order of events. So we're going to have 4 speakers, and I'll go through each of them in a second, and then we'll have a break in between our speakers and kind of moving on to the more interactive discussion, and then we'll also have some time for a Q&A, and then any closing comments from our panelists. And next slide, please. So real quick, I want to introduce our esteemed panelists. First, we have Dr. Aaron Bernstein, and I'm going to pull up because I cannot remember all of the amazing, incredible things that each of these panelists are doing, so I have to read them off. So Dr. Erin Bernstein is the interim director of the Center for Climate Health and the Global Environment at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, a pediatrician at Boston Children's Hospital, and an assistant professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Bernstein focuses on the health impacts of the climate crisis on children's health and advancing solutions to address its causes to improve the health and well-being of children around the world. Dr. Bernstein also leads Climate MD, a Harvard Chan Sea Change program to encourage physicians to transform climate change from an issue dominated by politics and concerns about the future or faraway places to one that matters to every person's health here and now. He is the course director for Human Health and Global Environmental Change and created the Harvard X course, The Health Effects of Climate Change, which explores how climate change influences health through its effects on air quality, nutrition, infectious diseases, and human migration, as well as solutions to the climate crisis. Through this course, thousands of students from over 100 countries have learned how climate change directly impacts their lives and what they can do to become part of the solution. He's done a lot more than that, but we really would be here for 3 hours if I read out all of these speakers' biographies. And next slide, please. Our next speaker is joining us from very far away, which is amazing. This is Ellen Davies. She leads the African Climate Foundation's research work. And prior to this, she oversaw the extractives and nuclear energy portfolios at World Wildlife Fund South Africa. Ellen has been working on questions of sustainable economic development for the past 10 years and has a keen interest in geopolitics, political economy, and gender. She holds a Bachelor of Social Science from the University of Cape Town, a Bachelor of Laws from the University of South Africa, a Bachelor of Commerce with honors, and a Master of Commerce from the University of Witwatersrand. All right, and next slide, please. Next up, we have Dr. Todd Sack, who is the Executive Director of the My Green Doctor Foundation that manages My Green Doctor. My Green Doctor is the world's most widely used resource for environmental sustainability and climate change preparation by healthcare clinics, offices, and outpatient centers. MyGreenDoctor.org, also available in Spanish, are used by thousands of health professionals in more than 80 countries and 43 US states. Dr. Sack serves on the board of directors of Physicians for Social Responsibility. He chaired for 10 years the Environment and Health section of the Florida Medical Association. He chaired his community's Environmental Protection Board and served on the Florida Energy Commission, where he chaired the Climate Change Advisory Group. He has authored 20 environmental and climate policies that were adopted by the American Medical Association or other organizations. Dr. Sack graduated from Yale College, was assistant professor of medicine at UC San Francisco, and practices gastroenterology in Jacksonville, Florida. He's my neighbor. And next slide, please. Our final speaker is Dr. Karen Solomon, who is the deputy editor at the New England Journal of Medicine, an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, and a physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Dr. Solomon leads efforts at the journal to expand attention to the health effects of climate change. She co-chairs the Harvard Medical School Faculty Council Subcommittee on Climate Change, is a member of the Brigham Climate Action Council, and has been actively involved in the Harvard Divestment Campaign. She is a founding member of Climate Code Blue, an organization of Boston area physicians committed to climate action and to amplifying the voices of frontline communities most affected by climate change. So as you can see, we have a very stacked, really incredible group of speakers. I also want to introduce one more important member of our panel today, and you just received a message from her. Cassidy is here with our tech support for the Zoom webinar. If you're having any issues, you can always message her and she'll be happy to help you. You can also message me and I'll be kind of working on the back end to make sure that things are running smoothly and you're being able to participate in the session. Next slide, please. All right, so let's see. And Cassidy, I wonder if you can, oh, I see what's happening. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties at the beginning, so our poll everywhere is not working at this moment. We'll get it back up and running in just a minute. But with that, let's go ahead and welcome Dr. Aaron Bernstein, who's going to be talking with us about the climate impacts and inequitable impacts of climate change, specifically here in the United States. So with that, Dr. Bernstein.
Thanks so much, Lauren, and what a pleasure it is to be with everyone today and to share this opportunity with some extraordinary fellow panelists. I'm charged in the time I have to present the issues of climate and equity within the US context. And I'm just gonna bring up my slides here. Okay. Can you all see my slides?
Dr. Solomon, I think that it's in the presenter mode.
In the presenter mode. Okay. How about now?
Perfect.
Great. Okay. So my remarks I've titled Health Equity Requires Climate Action, and I will endeavor to explain why I think that's the case. I'm mindful that we have recently lost one of the most extraordinary people I ever have known, Paul Farmer, who, among many things said that have left an impact on me, is that the idea that some lives matter less is the root of all what's wrong with the world. And I think that is absolutely true when it comes to the climate crisis. I'm going to point out that whether we're talking about mitigating the climate crisis, reducing the causes, adapting to the climate crisis, trying to prevent harms from the climate change that's already here and that will come, we have a lot at stake for health equity, and that the dimensions of equity aren't limited to the typical ones that revolve around current day issues. They revolve around intergenerational concerns. And lastly, that we have real opportunities to promote health equity through climate action. So the first point of departure is around adapting to climate change. So this is a picture that many of you will be familiar with. It's the flooding of New Orleans around Hurricane Katrina. And much of the flooding that occurred was a consequence of various levees having been breached by the storm. In this instance around Katrina, among the zip codes that were most heavily affected in terms of damages, almost all of them were 75% or more African American. And we see this compounding effect of systemic disinvestment in poor communities of color in the United States and climate shocks, whether they're hurricanes, wildfires, heat waves, time and again, so that communities that have been historically disadvantaged through systemic processes, often on the basis of race, are the harms from climate shocks like Hurricane Katrina are amplified. The infrastructure that is present in their communities, whether it's levees or power grids, are less well maintained. And so when the climate shocks occur, they bear greater burdens to their welfare. And the consequences of these inequities are not just in the immediate aftermath of the disasters. The Katrina cohort is probably the best studied, well, one of the best studied cohorts long-term after a climate-related disaster. And the most recent follow-up is a decade out, where there are major mental health effects that persist, including not just elevated levels of generic psychological distress amplified over time, but symptoms particularly of post-traumatic stress. And the post-traumatic stress symptoms are a function of how much trauma you experienced in the disaster. And so you can see quite clearly with Katrina as a prime example of how climate shocks really can exploit existing inequities and compound them over time. That's on the adaptation front, and it really, underscores this interface again between existing inequities and climate shocks that can exploit them. And this, of course, is not just true in the United States; it's true globally, and you'll hear more about the global picture shortly. This is a picture that many from the West Coast of the United States may be familiar with. It's a photo of downtown Los Angeles. And this isn't a hazy photograph because of a bad camera. It's a hazy photograph because of air pollution. LA County has both some of the worst air quality in the country, not to mention the state of California. But LA County is one of the poorest counties in California. And turns out that pollution and poverty are bedfellows. We routinely see those who are least well off in the communities we live in, both in the United States and around the world, exposed to the most pollution. In the United States, the source of pollution in places like Los Angeles is overwhelmingly fossil fuels. And Again, communities of color, because they have been discriminated against in housing practices and zoning rules, have been more or less forced into communities where air pollution is worse. We know this nationwide in the United States, and it's true in other countries around the world as well. There is a double injustice when it comes to fossil fuel-based air pollution. And of course, fossil fuels are the lion's share of what is driving climate change, and they're also driving something to the tune of millions of deaths every year. Based on the estimates you look at, it may be between 1 in 8 or 1 in 10 deaths may be from burning fossil fuels in the world. In the United States, there are some 100 or 150,000 deaths every year from burning fossil fuels, and those deaths are not equally distributed, as I mentioned, among people's wealth status and race and ethnicity. They also, the folks who are most harmed by it are least responsible for producing it. So there's an injustice in who has to breathe the polluted air, but those who are breathing the polluted air are also least responsible for it. And particularly in the United States, that's Black Americans and Hispanic Americans are most affected. Now, the flip side of that, which is a critical piece, is that many of the health inequities we see in the United States, whether it's mortality rates from COVID, whether it is rates of asthma exacerbations, whether it is any number of health outcomes that are associated with breathing air pollution, can be remedied through climate action. If we get ourselves off fossil fuels and are relying on energy sources that do not create pollution in poor communities of color, we will in fact address one of the great sources of health disparities and inequity in the country. So those are two of the more common views of health equity, both from climate adaptation and from mitigation that work on a current day time frame, right? So these are things happening right now, and actions matter to the present. But there's another key component of inequity that comes up with climate change, and that's intergenerational equity. I would say in my lifetime, there have been few experiences more powerful than going into a redwood forest in California and looking at a tree that is big enough for a car to drive through its trunk. Turns out that many of the old growth forests of the world, not just redwood forests, have been chopped down and transform our ability to appreciate what exists in the natural world. The changing climate creates inequities between one generation and the next that are unprecedented in human history and hard to fathom how they would play out well over time. We will surely be looked at in our generation as a generation that had immense responsibility and opportunity to act on science and to work towards addressing what would be and what already is a great source of intergenerational injustice. And again, it is certainly within our grasp to take actions to limit the effects of the intergenerational inequity about the kind of a world that our children and grandchildren will have and the opportunities it will afford them, opportunities that we in most cases take for granted today. The first places in the world where this is likely to appear and already are appearing are in the South Pacific island states where it is quite clear that those communities will not be habitable and those cultures will more or less be lost because of the loss of their lands. But make no mistake that the changing world due to climate change will affect communities in the north and south of the planet, and at a time scale that is within the reach of people whose grandchildren they will know. So intergenerational equity is a part of the climate equity piece that we're still getting our heads around, but it is a crucial piece. There have been some recent scientific studies that underscore the scope of the inequity in concrete health terms. A paper in Science just in the past year, for instance, found that a cohort born in 1960 compared to a cohort from 2020. The cohort in 2020 was on a population average level likely to experience 7 times more extreme heat events in their lifetime than the population from 1960. Similar estimates were made based on exposure to fires and crop failures and other consequences of climate change. But this paper and others start to give us a clear understanding of just how different the experience of a human will be absent climate action. And just to finish, I want to point out again that health equity requires climate action, and that comes very much down to the local scale. This is a community garden in Roxbury, a neighborhood of Boston. Roxbury is one of the lower wealth communities of color in Boston. This garden does several things in the community. It provides a source of food. It provides green space, which Roxbury is a heat island, so it is hotter than other parts of the city. This cools down the neighborhood a bit. It provides a place for social cohesion. So as a public space, it gets people together and gardening. As a pediatrician, I believe that one of the best things we can do to combat pediatric obesity is to help our children learn to grow food and engage in growing food. And of course, producing local produce, if done in a resource, an efficient resource way, can actually provide food that potentially has lower carbon and water footprints than other foods from further away. So this is just an example of the ways in which climate action at a local scale can have a profound benefit locally, but if replicated, could have real benefits at the global scale. So with that, I will end and hopefully made clear why climate action is so critical to health equity. And I look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bernstein. Certainly a lot for us to take into our discussion. I'm going to try sharing my screen one more time. Y'all bear with me. Let's see. I did the old try turning it off and on again trick. Can everybody see my screen? Is it a black box?
We see a black box.
It's still the black box. I'm not sure what's happening. For whatever reason, Zoom chose the worst day to not work for me. But anyways, our next speaker is going to be Ellen Davies. So Ellen, you can go ahead and share your screen with us.
So good morning or good afternoon for anyone in my part of the world. I'm going to share my screen and then I'm going to switch off my camera because my internet is acting up a bit. So apologies for that. Lauren, can you see my presentation?
It looks great. You are having much more luck than I am today.
Okay, great. So what I'm planning to do today is to talk about the climate change impacts on Africa. And I want to apologize in advance because I'm not going to be painting a rosy picture. It really is, as my presentation title suggests, a case study in global inequity. My intention is not to depress you, but rather to give you some of the facts and hopefully to motivate you to take action in your pockets of influence, not only to advocate for change at home, but also to advocate for your leaders to do a better job in other parts of the world. So let's jump into it. Ooh, that's not going to work. Give me a second while I figure out. There we go. So Africa as a region has contributed very little to the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change. Its contribution as a continent with 55 countries or 54, depending on your politics, is less than 4% of cumulative global emissions. This is a drop in the ocean compared to regions like North America or Asia, which have contributed to around 29%, or to one country like the US, which has contributed to around 25%. Yet, Africa is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to climate change impacts. This map on the left comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC's latest assessment report. And what it illustrates is where there's evidence to support that climate change is already impacting human and natural systems in Africa. So the purple and dark pink show where there's high or robust evidence to support the attribution of impacts on human and natural systems to climate change. And what the map shows and what the IPCC report finds is that climate change impacts are already being felt across the continent. So we're already witnessing biodiversity loss, water shortages, reduced food production, loss of life, loss of livelihoods, reduced economic growth, and we're already seeing health impacts from climate change. So tens of millions of Africans are being affected by exposure to non-optimal temperatures and extreme weather. We're seeing increased range and frequency of infectious diseases, and we're seeing a wider distribution and more incidence of malaria. And unfortunately, things are not set, are set to get worse. This also comes from the IPCC report, and I'm sorry, it's not a very visually appealing slide, but it's my summary of what the IPCC anticipates is going to happen in Africa going forward. Of course, the impacts are felt differently across different regions on the continent, across different countries and within different countries. And the severity of the impacts will also depend on the extent to which the world is able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But nevertheless, under 1.5 degree, 2 degree, 2+ degree increase, these are the impacts that Africa as a continent is likely to experience according to the IPCC. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but what I do want to focus on is some of the health impacts. So what we see is that there's going to, or what the IPCC suggests, is that there's going to be an increase in malaria vector hotspots and prevalence of malaria. We're going to see more epidemics of dengue and yellow fever. We're going to see an expansion of the geographic range of zoonotic diseases like Rift Valley. We're going to see more deaths in children from diarrhea, more cholera outbreaks, more influenza pandemics and regional epidemics and pandemics of novel zoonotic viruses. We're going to see increased bacterial meningitis and bilharzia. We're going to see more deaths in sub-Saharan Africa from non-optimal temperatures. We're going to see adverse birth outcomes, including stillbirths and miscarriages from heat stress during pregnancy. And that's also going to have an impact on long-term behavioral and development of children. We're going to see more injury, loss of life, displacement from extreme weather events, increased rates of malnutrition and stunting, and of course, psychological impacts, so anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, all related to extreme weather events. So what's being done to support African countries, given that we're already affected by climate change, given that we're going to be even more adversely affected by climate change, and to put it bluntly, given that we've done very little to contribute to the mess that we're in? In a nutshell, not much, or if I'm being more diplomatic, not enough. In 2009, in the Conference of Parties in Copenhagen, developed countries recognizing that the developing world had contributed to the least to climate change, but was going to be the most severely impacted, committed to collectively contribute $100 billion a year to support the developing world. And as you can see from this graph from the OECD, they have fallen woefully short in realizing these commitments. But I think to make matters worse is that the majority of the finance that has been received from the developing world has gone to supporting mitigation, so stopping emissions. And a very small share of that funding has gone to supporting adaptation, so creating the conditions to allow countries to absorb climate change impacts. The support received has also been unequally spread, with middle-income countries receiving the lion's share and least developed countries and small island states, those that are most vulnerable, receiving a small share. And I think equally concerning is that the majority of funding that has come through has been in the form of loans. So this is simply added to vulnerable countries' debt burden. So surely, given the impacts that climate change is set to have on a continent like Africa, there must be, you would think at least, that there's a lot of research and a lot of research funding going into Africa. And unfortunately, Africa is also not a priority in terms of research funding. So from 1990 to 2019, only 3.8% of funding for climate change research was for funding for research on Africa. And to make matters worse, of that 3.8%, the vast majority of that funding went to researchers or research institutes in the global north. So the picture I've painted is very concerning, and hopefully we're coming out of the COVID pandemic. So what I want to do is to look at if there are any lessons that we can draw from the COVID response that can possibly shed light on what's to come from in terms of a climate response. I think the first and very important lesson is that it's abundantly clear that we as a global community, that global and domestic institutions, national and subnational governments are simply not prepared to deal with the systemic shocks of this nature. I think the second lesson is that clearly Africa is not a priority. And we've seen how vaccine inequity has played out over the past 2 years. So by early this year, only 540 million of the 9 billion vaccines produced went to Africa, a continent that represents 17% of the global population. And while people in the global north are receiving booster shots, only 10% of Africa's population is fully vaxxed. And it's only now 2 years down the line that an agreement has been reached between the US, South Africa, the EU, and India to lift WTO waivers on vaccine IPs. But they're still negotiating the text, and there are powerful interests opposing that waiver. So I think the biggest takeout from an African perspective is that we simply cannot wait on the global community to come to the party and to act to prevent climate change impacts. And we really need to fast track our own local solutions. This is my last slide, and I really want to leave you with the thought that not all hope is lost. There is hope, a light at the end of the tunnel. Around the world, there's increasing awareness around climate change and the need to act and act urgently. There are increasing calls to action and greater pressure on decision makers to take action. There are amazing youth activists like Vanessa Nakate and others who are championing the cause, and talking truth to power. And there are more and more linkages being drawn between climate change and development, or climate change and health, or climate change and inequity. So climate change is no longer being seen as a niche environmental concern. And I really do want to drill home the point about mobilizing and the power of campaigning. And if I draw an example from my own country, South Africa, in the 1990s, we were struggling to afford antiretrovirals that were necessary to deal with the HIV/AIDS epidemic that was ravaging the country. And pharmaceutical companies were simply unwilling to drop the costs. So what the South African government did was to pass a law allowing it to buy generic antiretrovirals. And Big Pharma, with the support of the US government at the time, took South African government to court, arguing that it violated the World Trade Organization rules. So South Africans mobilized en masse, thousands protested outside the court, and the result was that the litigation was withdrawn, a settlement was reached, and eventually Big Pharma effectively gave South Africa ARVs. So campaigning and mobilizing does work and does have an impact. And at a continental level, what we're seeing is that African governments are beginning to look at the opportunities at the nexus of climate change and development, and are spearheading interventions that can address both our climate change needs and our development needs. And this year, COP is being held in Egypt, the Conference of the Parties. So it's an African COP. It's an opportunity for us to elevate the issues of concern to our continent that are often not prioritized, like adaptation and loss and damage. And to close off, I really don't want to leave everyone feeling despondent, but rather to motivate you to join these struggles and to use your spheres of influence to put pressure on your leaders to do better in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. What absolutely inspiring words and such a great wake-up call. So I'm sure that everyone's going to be really excited to continue discussing. Next up, we have Dr. Sack, who's going to kind of continue this really inspiring message of what can we do and some ways that we can kind of pursue activism. And again, if there are any questions as we're going along, feel free to add them to the Q&A box and the speakers can respond when they get a chance. Also, I promised Dr. Sack I would go through the instructions on using Poll Everywhere, and I accidentally lied to him because mine isn't working. So real quick, in a few minutes, Dr. Sack is going to have some slides that are going to have an option for Poll Everywhere. At the top of that screen is going to show instructions, and I'll also put the link that it's showing in the chat box. You can text the code it gives you to a certain number, or you can access it via phone or computer, the actual URL. When you do that, you'll be able to see these questions in real time and respond, and we'll be able to see everyone's responses. So, so hopefully it'll be really great to see what everyone's thoughts are. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Sack.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Can you all see me?
You were sharing your screen, but it's not anymore.
Do you see me?
I see you.
Okay, great. I'll just start by talking as me, and I'm going to try screen sharing. Great. Hello, everyone. I hope you see my screen. It's such a pleasure to be with you, and I want to thank you for devoting this time to this so important a topic. I desperately want to thank the Consortium of Universities for Climate Global Health and Lauren Aycock and her colleague Asia Payne. Gosh, Lauren, in the middle of a very busy surgical rotation in medical school, has put together this amazing program. Thank you, Lauren. It's people like you that are giving me the emotion of hope that we're going to get through this as a society. My name is Todd Sack. I use the pronouns he, him. I'm speaking to you today as Executive Director of the Migraine Doctor Foundation. And we're going to talk about climate equity and particularly practical solutions for busy healthcare practices. We're going to make this fun. We're going to learn a little bit about each other through a poll that Lauren and I are going to do with you. And I want you to go away with real tools that you can use in your practice. Let me see if we'll go to my next slide. You never know. There we go. Great. I'm a gastroenterologist in Jacksonville, as Lauren says. I was once a professor at University of California School of Medicine in San Francisco. I spent a lot of time giving community talks and continuing medical education lectures on climate change and health. If you'd like to have PowerPoint slides or talk to you about how to give talks and organize them, email me. I'd be happy to mentor you through those. And I help professional societies to adopt sound climate change policies, because if we're going to work with our professional societies, whatever your profession is, it begins by asking them to understand climate change and adopt sound policies. I chaired for many years the environment and health section of my state society, the Florida Medical Association. I was a member of the Florida Energy Commission and am currently on the board of directors of Physicians for Social Responsibility. And I'm speaking to you today as executive director of the Migraine Doctor Foundation. And I have no financial disclosures or have any financial interest in any of the topics I'm going to talk about today. I went backwards. Here we go. Today, we're going to talk about climate science and health equity, the importance of outpatient healthcare practices, because we're going to focus on what you can do in your practices, resources that are available for greening healthcare practices in clinics and offices. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes talking about the Migraine Doctor program itself, so you can perhaps get started with that today. So we're going to begin with a poll, and we're going to see if it's going to work. Yeah, I think it's going to work. the way you're going to do the poll is like you to grab your phone and go to messaging, go to text messages. And in the text message, you're going to text, let me grab my instructions. Excuse me.
I can help you out, Dr. Sack. So
Okay, yeah.
you're gonna, the number that you're sending the text to is 22333. That's who you're sending the text to. And the actual message of the text is going to be Lauren Acock 648. You can also copy and paste the link from the chat box and put that into a browser and go directly there as well.
So let's go ahead and do that. And we're going to do a test question first. And the test question is to give us your opinion about Todd's hair. And you can answer as many of these as you want. He's been pulling it out, worrying about health threats of climate change. He could use a bit more hair. He should consider shaving it bald. And I think it's about right, all things considered. So, and you can answer all of them if you'd like. This is just our text question. And all this is supposed to be in good fun. We'll give another 30 seconds for people to answer the questions. So again, you text 22333, Lauren Acock 648. Okay, I think we'll close the poll. It looks like he's been pulling out his hair worrying about climate change. I could use a bit more, but most people are being very generous, telling me it's just about right, all things considered. So let's go to the next question. So I want to hear who's here today. And the question is, do you work at all in an outpatient healthcare setting, such as a clinic, an office, a dispensary, an ambulatory care center, a diagnostic center, a pharmacy? So we'll get a sense of who's here. You might be a healthcare practitioner, you might be an administrator, you might run a department that's responsible for ambulatory care centers or clinics. So let's answer now, again, going to 22333, Lauren Acock 648. Answer the questions now, please.
This one did not want to behave for us earlier. So unfortunately, it doesn't do the cool thing where it goes back and forth, but I can see that we're collecting answers. And Dr. Sack and I talked about saving the data so that we can hopefully use this in the future and kind of show some of the responses.
So it is taking answers?
Yes, sir. We have 18 so far.
Okay, let's give it another 30 seconds. Do you work at all in outpatient healthcare? And this is a really neat technology. It's a company called polleverywhere.com, and it's free. So it's really fun to use. Okay, why don't we close the poll? And Lauren, tell us the results, please.
Let's see here. And anyone having issues, you can also just type it in. So it's, I've put it there. I'm not sure, Cassidy, do you have a better way to actually send out the link to people so that they can access it from their devices? And
sorry. The best way, yeah, would be via the chat.
All right. So let's see what our answers are here. And Dr. Sack, I'll let you know if you want to go to the next question. I'll look that up.
Do you think you'll have the answers in a moment, or should we go on?
You can go on ahead.
Okay. Well, this is going to the next question, which is, what are your roles in healthcare in the outpatient setting and choose all that apply. You might be an administrator, have other management duties. You might be a teacher or instructor. You might be a healthcare provider yourself, such as a nurse practitioner, doctor, pharmacist, acupuncturist, therapist, or maybe you have clerical or computer or cleaning responsibilities or involved in food service or maintenance or other. And you may have many of these. And that one's populating nicely. We'll give this another 20 seconds. And while we're waiting, if I see a number of people have other for their roles, and maybe put in the chat an example of what you might do in an other role. That might be illuminating to us. Okay, we're going to stop the poll and we can see them together that about a third of us are teaching, about a third of us are are direct practitioners, about 16% of us has administrative or management responsibilities, and 21% are other. So I'll be eager to see what those are. So tell us in the chat what your other duties are. We'll go to the next question. If it'll let me. Oh, I went too far, excuse me. Okay, now let's get to the nuts and bolts. Do any of the places where you work in an outpatient healthcare setting have any environmental sustainability or climate change policy? Not what you're actually doing, but do you have a policy about it? Have you agreed to work on climate change? Do you have a climate change policy now? And this is for your outpatient setting, not your hospital. And we'll give this 20 more seconds. I think you're getting pretty good at this. Okay, we'll close the poll. And this is encouraging. 44% of you wish you had something like this in your outpatient setting. Discouraging, only 22% do. That you've talked about it is encouraging as well to me. So I think this is helpful information. We wish we did. We don't wish we did. And finally, do any of the outpatient healthcare locations where you work have regular meetings where environmental sustainability is discussed? Maybe once a week it's on your agenda, or once a month, or once a quarter it's on your agenda. Yes, no, no, but we used to have meetings, or no, but some of us have talked about this. No, but I wish we did. And there's no right answer here. You can even answer to more than one of these. We'll give this 20 more seconds.
And while people are answering, I did get the results. I put the picture in the chat box actually, but it looks like 28% said yes, they work full-time in an outpatient healthcare setting, 6% work part-time, and 67% do not work in an outpatient setting.
Okay, great. So we have a lot of hospital-based people here, or not in healthcare. Okay, let's stop that poll. So do any people have regular meetings? 20% yes, that's encouraging. 40% no, lots of opportunity there. And the remainder of either talked about it or wish they did. So lots of opportunity. And finally, what activities has your outpatient practice done in the past 6 months, if any? All that apply. I think that's the last poll question. So recycling, that's encouraging. Ooh, nothing at all. Twenty more seconds. Okay, we'll stop the poll here. And I think it's encouraging that offices are working on a variety of topics. Recycling around 10%, saving energy, which is where the biggest financial savings are as well, 24%. Safer cleaning methods. I think that's terrific to read because chemicals can be so dangerous in the home and in the workplace. Patient education, just 4%. Lots of opportunity there. Healthy food choices, that's encouraging. Healthy foods for the environment and for our patients. Taking actions to reduce the use of paper. Of course, the electronic health record can help with decreasing paper use. It can also make it worse. Green purchasing, 12%. So that's terrific. Okay, so well, here's one more question. If your practice does not have an active sustainability program, why not? Please choose all that apply. I think this is the last question. We have not discussed this. We don't know how to start. Too busy. No one to lead us. This will take a lot of time. This will be expensive. Don't have support from our managers. Give this 15 more seconds. Okay, I think that this is where we'll stop the polling because this is so important. We've not discussed this topic. And in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to offer you easy ways to get that conversation going and to tell you how and where to start. Too busy with other priorities. Yes, we're so busy. And of course, the COVID crisis has only made this worse. But I'm going to offer you ways to do this even in a very, very busy practice. No one to lead on this topic? Well, it could be you, or I can share with you today resources you can share with others. This will take a lot of time. I'm encouraged that people don't feel that way or that it will be expensive because neither are true. And not having the support of practice management, I'm going to share with you reasons why your managers should make this a priority and how easy it is for them. So with that in mind, we're going to close the polling. And I want to talk about and remind us about health equity and the devastation that climate change is posing to climate vulnerable people. This is my town of Jacksonville, Florida, following Hurricane Irma in 2017. Sadly, not a very potent hurricane, only a level 1 on the 1 to 4 scale. And yet these are middle and lower middle class people. And some of them probably people who fit in the poverty range, whose homes were devastated by Hurricane Irma. Terrible, terrible tragedy, economic, health, emotional tragedy for these families. And thousands of families in my town were affected in 2017. Why did this happen? It's a result of poor planning and, as Dr. Bernstein pointed out, leaving the most vulnerable socioeconomic groups in our communities also most vulnerable to climate through poor planning, poor infrastructure investment, and just ignoring in zoning priorities, ignoring people's human needs. And the emotional toll is just so overwhelming to families. I know you've all seen what the effects of climate change are and the health impacts, but I want to just emphasize the health impacts of these, the health impacts of rising temperatures, rising sea levels, and the extreme weather events. These are the three core effects of climate change. Extreme weather events, of course, being extreme heat events, the rainstorms, the hurricanes and tornadoes, the flooding, and then the droughts and fires. What are the health impacts of these? Heat-related deaths, asthma and heart attacks, because as you know, the actual warmer temperatures increases the rate of photochemical smog formation in the atmosphere. And of course, on warmer days, people are cranking up the air conditioner, burning more fossil fuels to stay cool. Cancers increase because of the burning of fossil fuels, which puts carcinogens into the environment. Emotional illness as a result of climate events, the infectious disease risks of Lyme, Zika, malaria, and others that both Dr. Bernstein and Ellen Davies told us about, malnutrition and famine, and finally wars and the climate refugees occurring because of climate change. So do each of these health effects have greater impact upon historically excluded groups? Absolutely. Heat-related deaths, because poor socioeconomic groups are going to have substandard health care, but also substandard places to live and work. The air conditioners are more likely to fail. The infrastructure of electricity is less likely to get to the homes. More asthma and heart attacks because of indoor air pollution and more vulnerability in their homes. Increased cancer because of greater exposures to carcinogens in general, and also to fossil fuel emissions. Emotional illness, yes. Infectious disease, yes, because of their neighborhoods having poor infrastructure, famine and malnutrition, and becoming war and climate refugees. All of these will have and are having greater impacts upon historically excluded groups. So I want to now pivot and talk about how important are our places of work, our outpatient healthcare practices themselves. I want to make the case that our clinics and offices are important. And this data is US healthcare based, but I think it's relevant to many places in the world. The US healthcare industry itself is responsible for 5 to 10% of all the US greenhouse gases and toxic air pollutants. And in America, this results in 405,000 years of lost life every year, just because of the fossil fuels burned to run our healthcare industry. Really a devastating number. Now, what's outpatients' role? Outpatients' share of this greenhouse gas and air pollution impact is 26%. There are millions of healthcare offices worldwide. I believe there are huge opportunities to save resources and money. I think we can influence the choices made by our patients by dealing with climate change and health and teaching our patients in our offices. And finally, I think that health practitioners, health professionals have a unique ability to reach climate vulnerable communities in a way that government and other agencies and other NGOs are not able to. So we have access to patients and communities that others don't have. We also are trusted. This is a poll that's been done over and over again in the United States, but it's been done on every continent, including Africa, that when you ask communities, who do you trust? Which professionals do you trust for honesty and high ethical standards? Nurses, medical doctors, and pharmacists are always in the top 10 and usually in the top 5. So what we do in our offices concerning environmental sustainability and climate change, what we talk to our patients about, we can have a real influence. And we need to exploit that influence. We need to exploit that trust to really have impact on the decisions made by our patients, made by their families in their homes. And I think ultimately, by talking with our patients, by sharing wise information with our patients, we can influence their decision at the ballot box as well. I think that's really important to always keep in mind. So now what would I want to say to you working in an office, or what would I want to say to your managers, or maybe even the manager of your healthcare system that may own your clinic or own your office and manage it? What are the benefits of going green? Well, first of all, it saves money. And when I talk about sustainability and climate change, I always lead to managers and health professionals with this message that you're going to save money by doing this. So go ahead and do it. What's to lose? But we decrease also our uses of energy, water, chemicals, and other resources. We improve office teamwork and staff morale. I've been to many, many, many green team meetings in offices, and I just love looking at the faces of people at all levels of the pecking order in an office and see how much they enjoy working in an office and in a clinic that's taking on these topics. I think that a sustainable office leads to a better patient office experience. I think it improves the public relations profile of the practice or clinic. And I think also can improve patient trust in the recommendations that they're getting for their healthcare from the nurses and nurse practitioners and their doctors. And after all, compliance with our instructions is always so important. Of course, it creates a healthier office to have less indoor air pollution and use chemicals more safely. We can encourage wise choices by patients and families. And ultimately, what's the bottom line? We can improve community health by decreasing the uses of fossil fuels, by using water more responsibly, chemicals, by eating healthier foods. So the bottom line is we can improve our health by dealing with environmental sustainability and with the consequences of climate change. So what if you're a big hospital system? There are lots of resources available for hospital. And even if you're one of the people answer a poll to say you're not working in an office, I want you to think about your hospitals. Maybe you don't even work in a hospital, but maybe you go to a hospital. Here's some of the resources available for hospitals. Healthcare Without Harm, their website is noharm.org, and they have an organization called Practice Green Health and their Healthy Hospitals initiatives. If your hospital doesn't belong to Healthcare Without Harm, if they don't use some of the protocols that Healthcare Without Harm offices, they really should. So ask your hospital administrator, are we doing Practice Green Health or not? If not, ask them to. And hey, if there's a sustainability committee in your hospital or in your medical center, go ahead and join it. I think you'll meet with some really cool people and you'll enjoy contributing as a health professional. The American Hospital Association has its sustainability roadmap, and there's similar services offered by hospital associations in Europe, Asia, Australia, and I suspect Africa too, but I'm embarrassed I don't know what those organizations are. The kind of topics that hospitals deal with are a little bit different from most of our office topics, but they include eliminating solid waste incinerators, eliminating mercury devices, using energy wisely, and even employing renewable energy, waste management, reusing materials, embarking on serious recycling, being interested in packaging, and finally trying to minimize the use of plastics, greening the hospital supply chain so that we use our buying power as big hospital systems to influence the supply chain itself, dealing with the climate warming anesthetic gases to try to minimize use of those or to trap them and not let them be released in the environment, transportation choices by our patients, by our hospital staffs, climate advocacy, which now many hospitals are doing, which is quite exciting in their local communities at the state level and some even at the national level in their host countries. And finally, food choices. Many hospitals now have healthier food choices on the hospital tray for patients in the cafeteria, encouraging their staff and their patients to think about healthier foods at home. So that's really encouraging. But how about resources for practice managers and professionals in our clinics and our offices in the outpatient setting? And there are some resources that I want you to be aware of. I love the Royal College of General Practitioners in the UK's Green Impact for Health program. The website is there, greenimpact.org. It's a really interesting program that any office can use with a neat scoring system for going green. There's a new resource just recently created for the nursing profession called Nurses Drawdown, which offers some tools that nurses can do in their healthcare practices themselves. The American College of Physicians has its climate change toolkit, which is free. You don't have to be an ACP member to use their toolkit, with nice brochures and handouts for the waiting room. And the service that I manage called My Green Doctor exists at two websites, mygreendoctor.org in English or mygreendoctor.es for our Spanish preferred health professionals and patients and communities. And I'm going to spend the next couple slides talking about how to use My Green Doctor. But I'm a fan of each of these services. I encourage you to take advantage of any of them or all of them. So what is My Green Doctor? This is a comprehensive, free environmental sustainability practice management program for healthcare offices. So it's a practice management program primarily. It's evidence-based, written by health professionals. It's quite comprehensive, more than 450 pages of content. Though, as you'll see in a few minutes, we don't expect very many people to need all that content. We make it much easier for you. It's suitable for any outpatient setting, outpatient clinic, office, imaging center, diagnostic center, or facility. You could be a chiropractor, you could be an herbalist, you could be a pharmacist, you could be a gastroenterologist, but it's available for you. No study or science background is needed. We now have more than 800 registered offices using My Green Doctor in 45 US states and 61 different countries. And if you use our program in the United States, I know you can save about $1,500 per doctor per year with no financial investment. And other countries, I think, likewise. So there's real financial benefits to get you started, but real benefits for your community health, bottom line. We now have 21 health professional societies that participate in My Green Doctor. These are big organizations like the American Academy of Family Physicians with more than 120,000 members, the World Medical Association with members in more than 110 countries, and small societies like the Alameda Contra Costa Medical Association in Northern California. And these are organizations that offer My Green Doctor to their members as a free membership benefit, meaning they will share this information with their members and encourage their members to use My Green Doctor in their practices. Participating with My Green Doctor is free to the organization and free to the members of the organization. And there's significant financial benefits of receiving My Green Doctor from your health professional society. If you think your professional society might want to offer My Green Doctor to its members, give me a call, give me an email, and we'll make that available to your members for free. When people register My Green Doctor, they get a handsome Green Doctor Office Pledge Certificate, which is available in any language. We encourage offices to print this out, buy an inexpensive frame, and display it proudly in their waiting room and in their break room, really to brag about their work on environmental sustainability, to set an example for the patients, to say, hey, we're doing this, how about you in your home? We offer a meeting by meeting guide, which asks practices to add 5 minutes to each regular practice planning meeting. So if your office may deal with business issues as a group once a week or once a month, or maybe the staff members huddle every morning to talk about practice issues, let's add 5 minutes to each regular planning meeting agenda, once a week or once a month. Each 5-minute session is fully scripted. It explains exactly what to say and do at each meeting. And the benefit of that, there's nothing for the manager or the sustainability leader or the physician leader to study or prepare. Everything is provided for you in this careful, easy script. You know, we focus on small, steady improvements. We don't want offices to take off more than they can handle. We ask you to make 1 or 2 small decisions for the practice each time you meet with this 5-minute agenda item. We also emphasize patient and staff teaching. We try to involve every member of the healthcare practice, not just a few people who happen to say they want to do this. And we provide the Green Team notes form for easy record keeping. And that's important because we want you to keep track of your successes so you can brag about them, but also so you can apply for the My Green Doctor's recognition certificate once you qualify. How about green teams? A big no to green teams in the office. I've been to many office green teams. We used to recommend that a medical practice find a group of people interested in sustainability, that they meet over lunch with pizza maybe once a month and talk about sustainability options for the practice. And what I've learned is that 100% of green teams structured the way I just described, 100% fail. We don't want to have a small group of elite members of the practice work on sustainability. We want sustainability to be for the whole practice. And so I encourage you not to have a green team that meets once in a while in your office, but rather involve the whole team of the healthcare practice, everyone who works there, and make My Green Doctor or whatever service you use, make it part of your regular practice management meeting. 5 minutes is all we ask, but put it on every agenda and have it stay there so you deal with this. These are the topics, some of the topics we work on at My Green Doctor. understanding the carbon footprint of the practice, embracing energy efficient appliances such as the Energy Star appliances in the US with similar appliances available around the world, to look at your choices of chemicals. For example, in the US, we have the Safer Choice chemicals, more than 5,000 products available that are healthier in the way they were made, healthier in how they affect people where they're used, recycling, avoiding reusable materials such as styrofoam and others, emphasizing healthy eating in the office, healthy eating at home. In the upper right are some of the materials we have for patient education, many posters and brochures for the waiting room. And finally, get that pledge certificate today and get it on your wall to encourage others to go green. So we have lots and lots of topics, but these are the core of our program. Okay, I'm almost done. So now we're going to get you started today. And I want you to begin by registering today at either mygreendoctor.org or mygreendoctor.es. It takes 3 minutes to register. It's confidential, it's free. And we'll send you your pledge certificate just for signing up today. The pledge certificate is available in any language. So if you'd like it in a language other than English, just let us know. You'll see on the registration page how to do that, and we'll send it out to you soon. Next, adopt sustainability as a core value. So speak to the managers of your practice, whether it's a practice administrator or a physician owner or a hospital system owner, and say, we want sustainability to be something we do. And that means adding 5 minutes of My Green Doctor to each practice management session, whether it's to your clinic huddle once a week or to the practice management meeting that may occur with everyone in the room once a week or once a month, but just get 5 minutes of My Green Doctor of sustainability onto the agenda, and plan to make small, steady improvements to your organization. I often see groups trying to do too much, to lead off with 4 or 5 things that they're going to do in the first month, and then that they just can't sustain that and it fails. So try using our meeting by meeting guide, small steady improvements. The goal is a sustainable environmental sustainability program, something you can really keep going in good times and in bad. Finally, provide patients with brochures, posters, and other teaching tips. We give you access to many resources from My Green Doctor and other places on the World Wide Web. And lastly, commit. Commit as a practice, as an organization, to qualifying for the Green Doctor Office Recognition Certificate. So the 2 things for today: register at mygreendoctor.org or mygreendoctor.es if you prefer in Espanol. That takes 2 or 3 minutes. And finally, watch the 3-minute video. The 3-minute video that'll tell you how to do this in 3 minutes. It's kind of summarizing what I just talked about in 15 minutes, but in just 3. And maybe share it with others in your practice. Anyone in the practice and everyone can register. So we're going to go back to our poll. I'm going to do one last polling question, and the question is, tell us all that apply. I'm worried about climate change and believe my profession and our patients can play a role in the solutions. I support my practice undertaking or continuing a sustainability program. I will register at My Green Doctor or with other resources that were discussed today. I will ask my practice to engage in this, or I will join or continue with our current work. And I will ask my professional societies to consider offering sustainability and climate change resources to the members. So we'll open up the poll. I see some of you have already started. You can answer more than one. Lauren, how many responses do we have?
Let me check.
Thank you. If you don't remember how to do this, you can be texting to 22333, Lauren, L-A-U-R-E-N, ACOCK, A-Y-C-O-C-K 648. Text that to 22333.
Once you do that, I failed to mention, you can text options A, B, C, D, E. So if you actually text the letter, that'll put your vote in.
Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Let's see. All right.
With that information, we'll give it 10 more seconds.
Yeah, looks like we have 16 so far.
Okay. So people may be a little challenged, or maybe they're driving. If you're driving, don't try to answer this poll. We give it
And I
10
see
more
some
seconds.
people have also been answering in the chat box as well.
Oh, good. Okay. Okay, well, we'll stop the poll now and let's just talk about these numbers. So these aren't questions that I invented out of the blue. Some of these questions have been asked in other polls and in regional levels, both in the United States and in Europe and in Australia as well. That's the first one. I'm worried about climate change and believe my profession and our patients can play a role in solutions. I was surprised only 41% said yes. I'm going to assume that some of you didn't know they could answer to yes to more than one question, or maybe the poll methodology didn't let you. When you look at other polls, and there've been 3 or 4 asking this question of health professionals, now closer to 90% of health professionals are worried about climate change and believe that their profession can play a role. So I hope you're a little more worried about that. And I think you probably are. I support my practice undertaking but continuing this. I'm surprised only 18% said yes. I will register at My Green Doctor. Thank you. I will ask my practice to engage in this, or I will join to continue our work. And finally, I will ask my own professional societies to consider offering sustainability and climate change resources to its members.
And I
18%.
think that the percentages are the split of the proportion of the responses. So I think a lot of people answered yes to that top one, and then also answered yes to other ones. So it was confusing.
Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, you're right. I see how it's doing that. I'm going to go to my last slide, if it'll let me. There we go. That is my last slide here. Climate change equity, practical solutions for busy healthcare practices. I want to thank you for going green today by registering at My Green Doctor or one of the other services that I recommend. And look at the 3-minute video and talk to your colleagues. You can do this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sack. And again, we're going to be kind of fielding these questions and even more in our discussion. And thank you. I see some people have started utilizing the Q&A function. So we see your questions and we'll get to those, and the speakers feel free to answer them as you see something come in. And last but not least, for our kind of presentation portion of the morning, we have Dr. Karen Solomon, who's going to kind of wrap this all together and talk about how can we implement this in education and advocacy.
So thank you so much. I got to tell you, I am having a slide problem because I can get them up, but then they are freezing. So I may actually need one of you guys to show my slides. Is that possible? Otherwise, I'll keep trying.
I'll share your slides with Cassidy right now.
Okay, I'll give it one more whirl. I'm so sorry, you guys. Let's see. Okay. My computer is looking very unhealthy.
I know, I'm like, today is the first day I've ever had any issues with slide
Yeah, no, I've
sharing.
never not been able to share either. It's just I get onto them and I can't switch my mode or move them.
All right, I just sent your slides to Cassidy, so or
Okay,
Asia,
Cassidy.
if you're able to pull those up and share it. Oh, perfect. Cassidy's on it.
Thank you so much. And while I'm waiting for them to pop up, I just want to again thank Lauren and the other organizers and thank all of you who are here. Obviously, it's great that people are concerned about the issue, and we're hoping to give you some strategies. Cassidy, any success? Looking good. Okay, you guys, can we go to the next slide in the hopes that you can actually advance them? Yes, okay, fantastic. Okay, so I want to start by just giving a sense, at least in the US, where current attitudes are regarding climate change. So these data actually come from a series of cross-sectional surveys that are done through the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication. And essentially they divide the population into groups, depending upon, how convinced people are that climate change is real, that it's urgent, and that it requires rapid action, down to dismissive, which is, kind of climate change is a hoax. And what I want to say is a very positive sign is that the percentage of individuals who are alarmed has clearly increased substantively just in the last several years. But if you add up the percentages who are alarmed or concerned, we are still just kind of abutting 60%. So there's work to be done in really increasing the percentage of people who understand how critical the problem is and how rapidly we need to be addressing this is just necessary for us to do what needs to be done to protect health. Okay, so next slide. Beautiful. So this, you will have seen a very similar slide from Dr. Sack, but I want to say that mine, fortunately, puts doctors above military. Okay, so in general, healthcare professionals are considered, by people as the most trusted individuals to tell the truth. So this actually is very recent. It's relatively recent from 2020. In the UK, and there are a number of surveys like this. So as Dr. Sack pointed out, what we really want to do is we want to leverage this trust and use it to educate our patients, our colleagues, our students, our communities, and also our legislators. And I'm going to come back to that in a bit. Okay, next slide. So starting on the left, just in terms of patient education, even within a really busy office visit, and I don't know how many of you, in the audience are either docs or medical students or trainees or in other health professions, but we know that, office visits are packed with information, but we can and we really must bring up climate change where it is, clearly relevant. It does not have to take a lot of time. So just as one example, we certainly know that allergies are increasing just consistently in many areas of the United States and elsewhere. And that's because with warming, the growing season is longer. We also know that higher ambient carbon dioxide concentrations increase the amount of pollen released by plants. And so it is not uncommon at all for patients to mention worse allergies in the office, and a pretty easy opportunity to just point out the connection of that concern to climate change. Likewise, with asthma flares related to air pollution from burning fossil fuels or from the pollen in the air, et cetera. It's really important, given that we want to educate our patients about this, okay, that we're also educating our students and our trainees, and examples of that are shown here. I do want to point out that some people feel a little wary of mentioning climate change in talking to patients or others because they fear it's, quote, too political. And I just want to point out that it's not political. That basically our job, our responsibility is to protect our patients' health, and this is part of it. And there's also actually nice information that when we talk to someone who trusts us about climate change, it's much more likely that they're going to support climate action. So next slide. So I point this out just again, I don't know, how many are trainees and such, but there's a real move largely pushed by students and residents to get these topics integrated into medical school and residency curricula. So I actually just show one example here that was led by residents at the Brigham and the Mass General. Several faculty, were involved in supervising them, but they really pulled together a way of very simply integrating climate change by inserting slides in a lecture on asthma, talking about how that relates, in a lecture on chronic renal insufficiency, talking about the association between heat and renal disease, et cetera. And if you guys want to have a look at this, it actually gives some really excellent practical pointers for doing this. Meanwhile, the group of residents who spearheaded this have joined with others at Columbia and out at UCSF to develop a body of slides that will be free to anyone who wants to use it, in order to really make sure there's a comprehensive and integrated curriculum relating to climate and health. Next slide. So part of what we can do to educate people is actually to point out the greenhouse gases we are creating that we need not. And Dr. Sack has talked about this with respect to the office, but I actually just want to point out professional travel as an example. So it's very, very common, obviously not just in the medical profession, but in many professions, at least pre-COVID, and now, kind of in the middle endish, we maybe end, but as we move through COVID, people are kind of starting to travel again. And here's just one example from a meeting of the American Thoracic Society where the authors here just kind of pulled together what were people's carbon emissions. So there were about 15,000 attendees at this meeting. They calculated emissions just based on their air travel, and that was about 11,000 tons of carbon dioxide. And that amount for one not even particularly large meeting in the US is equivalent to the greenhouse gas emissions produced yearly by about 550 people in the US. I would also add, given our international focus here, the US tends to create more. So if you actually went out into many, many other countries that are less developed, we're talking about something many-fold more than the 550 US citizens. So we certainly know, and again, really figured this out during COVID, that virtual conferences, as we are doing right now, can work really well. And we also know that a lot of companies recognizing this and also being pushed now a little bit more to reduce their own greenhouse emissions are trying to move to a reduction in travel. So I want to just suggest that we all be thinking about this, as we, and for those of you who are in training, this will be more, subsequently kind of how much travel you're going to do. Next slide. This also actually applies to interviewing, and this here is a study that relates to residency interviews, but it could relate to grad school or other types of interviews. This again was just a little survey done at the University of Michigan, where they surveyed members of the graduating class, and here they looked at plane, car, or train travel to interviews, and they were estimating it looked like about 14 interviews per student. And again, we're talking about a lot of greenhouse gases. So here, we're talking about 51,000+ metric tons of carbon dioxide. And again, there are ways around this, bunching interviews in geographic regions, or again, turning to virtual where possible, among other options. Next slide. Okay, so back to legislators. One way that we really must use our trusted voices is to get involved in legislative advocacy, okay? And that can be at the local, the state, and or the federal level. So for example, contacting our representatives by email, calling them, asking for a meeting with them, or writing op-eds in the paper or letters to the editor, and really making clear how various bits of legislation or policy that are affecting greenhouse gas emissions in positive or negative ways affect health. And I think what we must keep in mind, and it relates directly to the focus of the current session, is that certain groups, as the preceding speakers have made very clear to you, are clearly disproportionately affected. And we have a responsibility to amplify those voices. And so when we're writing in, pointing out that developing moving to 100% renewable energy is expected to really reduce health problems among groups of individuals, communities of color, poor communities that are disproportionately affected. And voting has been mentioned. We also want to vote for candidates who are committed to addressing climate change. Just want to mention it can be very helpful to join an advocacy group. I gave some examples here. They can be local grassroots groups, medical groups, international groups, but besides just connecting you with like-minded individuals, they can actually make it very easy for you to weigh in on policies. So that, again, that can range from the local level to really, what we should be contacting our senators and our Congress people about. And I want to thank Professor Davies, for pointing out, I think, my talk is very focused on what we're doing domestically, but again, we can certainly and really must weigh in on, federal activities. Are we going to commit that money to help, places that are less resource rich than the United States to meet the challenges that are coming with climate change? And I think our voices need to be heard. And oftentimes, again, those coming from the medical profession and focusing on health can have a really powerful voice in this process. Next slide. These are just two examples. I'm not going to go into them, but of bills in Massachusetts that I and other colleagues have been pretty active in weighing in on. So there's an effort to move to 100% renewable energy in Massachusetts. Ideally by 2045, it would be electricity fully renewable by 2035, and then transportation and buildings by 2045. The act below is just an act that actually links affordable housing with resilient and sustainable housing and provides financial support through deeds, taxes, in order to support that. And so there are many, many bills. And again, it's fairly easy to find out about them again just by joining advocacy groups. Next slide. So another way in which we can advocate relates to institutional divestment from fossil fuels with reinvestment in sustainable, equitable businesses. So just to kind of review where we are with this. So we know that if just the largest oil companies use their current stores of oil, we are going to exceed 1.5 degrees of warming. And the goal, as I think you all know, has been to stay below that. That's becoming kind of increasingly challenging. But the closer that we stay to that, as opposed to going up to 2.5, 3 degrees of warming, the better off we will be in terms of health and multiple other outcomes. So very much like the process of divesting from cigarette companies, which turned out to be very powerful and was led or certainly involved many health professionals. This is another area in which health professionals would very reasonably be involved. An issue is not just what will happen from the burning the oil that we have, but very importantly, and as I think you all know, the fossil fuel companies, just like the cigarette companies before, have consistently and willfully misled the public on climate change. And in fact, what's pretty striking is if you go back 40 years and you look at the predictions of their scientists for where we would go in terms of greenhouse gases and temperature rise and associated climate catastrophes, they were spot on in predicting this. And the way that they chose to deal with it was by funding politicians against the public good and by misleading the public. For example, with advertisements like you see here on the lower left. So this appeared in the New York Times in 2000 and talked about climate change being, quote, unsettled science, decades after, it was pretty clear what was happening. I show on the right just that while they are now admitting that climate change exists and publicizing plans to effectively address it, they continue to mislead in different ways. So here, for example, indicating that natural gas is a great alternative, and as I think you all know, it carries very serious health harms as well. Next slide. So I want to point out that the advocacy of many individuals, frontline groups, but again, often involving health professionals, has resulted in a lot of successes. And these include fracking bans in multiple states in the US. There are also fracking bans internationally. Many states have committed already to 100% renewable energy by sometime between 2040s to 2050. And with respect to divestment, I should actually have updated this number because at this point, over 1,500 institutions have committed to divesting from fossil fuels. Next slide. But some of that movement required more than just calling our representatives. And so while I certainly think the legislative advocacy, the talking to our colleagues and communities, et cetera, is critical to what we do, I want to point out that some are choosing to go a step farther. And shown here are a couple of examples. So on the left, we see health professionals in multiple states who joined with indigenous communities to protest expansion of the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota. And we know with this pipeline, then it will release emissions similar to that of 50 coal plants annually. So there has been, unfortunately, so far ineffective, but vigorous effort to keep that from proceeding because it is absolutely not aligned with our federal climate goals. And then shown on the right are a group of health professionals in the UK participating in a die-in outside of JP Morgan. And the reason for this, and it's something that we also need to be thinking about, is that the big investment companies and banks are really financing a lot of the fossil fuel company generated destruction. So back in, for example, the year before last, the combination of JP Morgan, Citibank, and Bank of America financed the fossil fuel industry to a tune of $140 billion. And so there is an increasing movement of activists to actually call out not just the fossil fuel companies, but those who are providing them the finances to continue engaging in those activities. And while some of this may seem, a little extreme to some of you, I think it's really important here to point out a quote from Richard Horton, who's the editor of The Lancet, back in 2019, where he pointed out that engaging in these kinds of nonviolent social protests to address the climate emergency, that's the duty of the doctor. Next slide. Here, I just want to point out that there are many, many opportunities to be involved. So this is another kind of classic problem. So this in Peabody in Massachusetts, there's a plan to build a peaker plant, which is again more fossil fuel infrastructure being built at a time where we have very reasonable renewable alternatives. These fossil fuel projects are routinely placed in environmental justice communities where people already have high rates of chronic illnesses related to air pollution, and then they increase those health risks. And so this is another example where local health professionals are working with the local community. And I think there are multiple opportunities, for those of you who want to get involved in this, obviously anywhere, because it's an ongoing problem in multiple places. Final slide. So I actually just want to conclude with a quote from Greta Thunberg. I think you're all familiar with her. So, teenage climate activist who really got the worldwide climate strikes going. And I'm not going to read this to you. You can read this yourselves. But I think the fundamental point is that it is past time for action. And we as health professionals or others in this audience who are, globally active and, concerned about equity and health, we really, must speak out and really propel action because it's needed imminently. So I just want to thank you for your interest, and I hope that you will all leave here with a plan to be engaging in kind of one of these domains. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Solomon. With that, we are going to take a quick break. I know that that was a lot of incredible information to digest, and so we want to make sure that we give everybody a second to refill those coffee mugs, hit the bathroom if you need to. Let's meet back at, let's say about 10 minutes, so around 2:55 my time, which I believe is 10:55 Pacific time. So if everyone wants to take a quick little break, and then we'll come back to it. In the meantime, also, if you're thinking of questions and don't want to forget them, feel free to put them in the Q&A. You can see we have a couple answered questions there already. Thank you, everybody, for contributing to that. And when we come back, we'll kind of start our large group discussion about how to really implement some of these ideas and concepts, and just kind of discuss the issues that were raised this morning. So with that, we'll see everybody back here in 10 minutes. So I think we'll kind of go ahead and get started with our discussion. Earlier, I failed to introduce one other really vital member of this process, and that is Asia Payne, who is actually the leader of the Conference Planning Committee on the CUGH Trainee Advisory Committee. So thank you so much, Asia. She's also providing really valuable tech support for me right now, but she was really just instrumental in getting everything organized. Asia, if you don't mind pulling those slides back up, we're going to kind of get this started off by trying to get everybody, making sure that everybody's awake for the morning, and kind of see where everybody is. And so our first question is, where in the world are you? And I don't know if it is going to go live or not. If this doesn't work, that's okay, and we'll have a backup plan. Asia, was it going live for you earlier?
I believe so. Let's see.
This is just getting me today. These. Okay, it's showing live there. Why is it not showing live here?
I have poll everywhere open, so it should be live and it's logged in. So
Oh, that's not working then. All right, well, backup plan. So we'll just kind of, again, it's a discussion. We can just use the slides to actually put the questions up, Asia, and then we can just have people kind of respond in the chat box. So if you want to go to the next questions.
oh, there it is.
Oh, there, it's working now?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not seeing it quite yet. Interesting.
Do you
Well,
see the little green spots on the screen? Maybe it's just showing on mine.
I'm not. I wonder if,
Okay. It's okay.
oh, okay, yeah, here's, I'm seeing the question go live. Okay, nope. Technology is not our friends today. That's okay. Yeah, because it's letting me answer it. So it's live, but it's not showing up on the screen, but you can see it actually on your screen.
Yeah, it's like populating the green little location spots.
That is really weird. Yeah, it's not actually showing on the PowerPoint that's being shared. Interesting. Well, anyways, I imagine that everyone's from lots of different places, so that's great. We can go to the next one. Oh yeah, there we go. People are sharing it in the chat where they're currently at.
Hold on a second. It's oops.
Oops.
I need to get the next.
There we go. And then I know that Dr. Sack also asked this question to everyone this morning, but what is everyone's different role? Very cool. So it looks like we have some administrators, some individuals in public health, some researchers. So a really wide variety of different of experiences, which is also really great. All right. And our next question, that I promise these will get to actual discussion. These were supposed to be the technology ones to make sure everything was working, which it's not, but that's okay. So I'm curious, when we hear the words climate change, some people have a really gut reaction. I feel like climate change has been a very politicized and very hot topic, especially here in the US. And so I'm curious, when you hear those words climate change, do you think global warming? Do you think going green? Do you think reduce, reuse, recycle? What have been some thoughts about the terms climate change? And panelists, please feel free to kind of jump in with your own experiences as well, and kind of what maybe your initial reaction was to that, and how your thoughts on it have changed. That term eco-destruction, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's definitely, John said, the global risk to health, welfare, and security. That's definitely something that I feel like we talk a lot about, oh, it's very expensive to go green and it's really expensive to invest in that. And I feel like there are a lot of arguments made in that, for instance, with COVID, and kind of say, oh, well, preventative health is too expensive and we can only focus on what we need right now. And we fail to recognize the security risks, and that could actually be a very potentially devastating to a country. And so hopefully that'll be a way to kind of get more action and more advocacy on board. Yeah. So a really wide variety, that's great. All right. And feel free to keep going, and let's go to our next question. So this is definitely can be a very emotional topic. Navneet, I know you've been very present in the chat, and I've also heard a lot of people saying that this is, you know, discouraging or terrifying even. So I'm curious, you know, what are people's emotional response to this topic? And again, panelists, feel free to unmute, turn your videos on, and absolutely jump in with your thoughts. Well, that's a really good point, Laura. How many people have to die to get attention? That was definitely, myself personally, something that I was very frustrated about, is that I felt like policymakers in the US were not going to do anything and are not going to do anything until it's, you know, the wealthy, influential, you know, higher class who are actually suffering. And at that point, then maybe they'll actually do something. And so unfortunately, by the time we get to that point, I feel like a lot of you know, our lower socioeconomic status communities, a lot of our kind of outward lying communities are going to suffer before we get to that point. And so that's a really discouraging thing for me to think about, is that a lot of people are going to suffer before the people who have the power to make change are actually going to start feeling the effects. And until it starts affecting pocketbooks of businesses and CEOs, that's when we're going to see the change. What are some other thoughts? Any of our panelists?
Lauren, from my side, I think that discussions like this motivate me because, and I think that other people have said this, that there are a lot of great people working on addressing climate change, and that for someone in this space to be part of a discussion with groups that I'm not usually part of a discussion with, and seeing what is being done both at the kind of personal level but also at the policy level is motivating. It gives me hope.
Yeah, and I would also just add that I think, you know, I think many of us got into trying to do something from a place of panic. And I think it is really, you know, it's sort of mentally healthy to engage in some sort of action, whatever kind of grabs you and fits with, you know, your interests and your skill set. But it you know, it kind of just feels better to be doing something.
Let's go to our next one. All right, so, and again, I apologize that our cool polls aren't working right now. We'll try to fix that on the back end, but you know, we talked about a lot of things that you can do. Do you feel like you actually have the power right now in your institutions to influence? Do you feel like you have the power to influence your communities? And maybe from our panelists, you know, what advice or what strategies did you utilize to actually gain influence?
I'm going to jump in again, Lauren. I think one of the things that we do in our work is really try to understand, and you had alluded to this, try to understand the political economy, what is driving certain decisions, who is driving them, why they're driving them, and use that to try and identify interventions. And then on a personal level, I think that it's very difficult to see how your actions create change. But there are many examples of, again, social movements that have really brought about massive changes, and just keep on reminding yourself that even just as one person, you can make a difference.
Yeah, I would add the experience of Dr. Andrew Lewandowski in Madison, Wisconsin, who's put into his pediatric office practice a script, a 45-second climate script that he tells to every patient. And it's not confrontational. It just says the things that we do at home matter. And we'd like you to advocate for renewable energy and do something in your home to make a difference. And he's surveyed his patients. They're very receptive. They're not hostile. It's not that hard to do. 45 seconds.
That's great. So another question I have is, what does everyone think are the best ways to actually enact change? Is it in your institutional level? Is it by voting? Is it by protesting? Is it by putting your money where your mouth is and boycotting? You know, what are some tools we have at our disposal as advocates?
I think all of the above.
I agree, but it's important to start in our own life and set an example for our neighbors and our family members, particularly for our children, so they adopt sustainability and climate change into their lives. And then to our patients, and then to our elected leaders, and then to our world.
And do you think that this is something that is more of a personal responsibility and that our personal choices are really going to have an impact? Or do you think it's more of we need to actually enact change by, you know, putting pressure on the larger organizations and on these huge capitalist mechanisms that might be fueling some of these changes?
There's a lot of debate about this in the environmental world. Do the small differences we make in our homes really make a difference? If we use plastic straws or not, or if we recycle or not, does it really make a difference? I think the answer is no and yes. The little things do matter in aggregate, but probably more importantly, when we ask our family and our neighbors to engage in these topics, that then they become better voters and better advocates in their community, as Dr. Solomon urged us to do, to go out and vote and advocate to our public officials. Yes, the little things we do matter, but the bigger things will matter more.
Yeah, and I do want to add, I mean, I absolutely agree that there's, you know, very reasonable for us to be, you know, composting and certainly reducing our consumption. And I know that was a point being made in the chat here. I mean, I think recycling, for example, it's nice that we try, but I think everybody's aware, at least in the US, that much of our recycling is going into landfills as opposed to being recycled. So I think we just have to start, you know, buying less new stuff and holding on to our stuff for longer. But I think it's very clear, and you know, Dr. Sack is alluding to that our personal actions are completely inadequate to fix this problem. And there's actually a really interesting article, I'm sure there have been many. I had read one in Vox, which was pointing out how basically fossil fuel companies are all into making it a personal responsibility problem. And, all you have to do is, recycle and do X or Y. And it's because it's a societal, structural, capitalist problem. And that's not to their interest for people to, understand the problem fully. So I think it's not that we shouldn't do good things, we should, but I think we need to recognize that it's a real structural problem.
There's a movement growing to decarbonize the healthcare profession and our hospitals particularly. Anybody want to talk about that? There's several places where this is people thinking about that our institutions, our big hospitals go net zero. Great. And many hospitals are now pledging to net zero, as are some companies. The other is in our prescribing practices to use, for example, inhalers that don't use propellants that are themselves greenhouse gases, and choose instead more responsible inhalers that don't do that. Choose packaging that's recyclable or doesn't even involve plastics if possible. So think about in our own institutions, can we decarbonize our industry? I think the British are way ahead of us on this, and we should follow their lead and that they're doing.
Yeah, and you guys may be aware of this, but so in the US, the National Academy of Medicine has made this their current initiative is the decarbonization of the healthcare system. So I certainly think it's getting more attention now. And there are a number of institutions that have made progress. I know, so I'm at Mass General Brigham, which has actually really done some very positive things. There's still a long way to go. I know Kaiser's done an enormous amount, but it isn't the norm. If you kind of survey healthcare institutions across the US, many are not engaged in this yet, and they need to be.
I don't think I've seen anything throughout really a medical school. I know the LEED certification, that's something we have in the US, and it's for buildings. And so I know that the new medical school building that they did was supposed to be environmentally friendly and be low or very high efficiency, low energy usage. But that's definitely not what we're seeing in the hospitals that have been there for decades. And gosh, every time I bungle opening up a pair of sterile gloves in the OR, I think about the fact that, oh gosh, those are going straight into the trash. And just the amount, I'm on my surgery rotation right now, so the amount of waste we go through, and I think somebody actually asked that. It was David. David said, in hospitals in many parts of the world, infection control measures require using disposables and incineration. What climate solutions can be proposed to reduce the effects from these needed practices? I think that's a really important question, because so much of medicine and sterility involves disposables.
Yeah, I was going to say, this isn't my area of expertise, but I do know for a fact that there are many items that can be sterilized and be reused that we toss. And there have been really interesting studies that people have done where often it involves like medical students or something who's like search through trash, in the ED or in the ORs, and point out how much unused stuff is thrown away. There are these pre-packaged kits in the OR, and people use sort of one item and they throw out the rest of the items. So I think there is a lot we can do. It's tricky to get systems to do that.
Absolutely.
Lauren, I think you've had some hands. I know at some point Navneet wanted to say something.
Yeah, Lori Thibodeau's had her hand up.
Let's see. Laura, I'm adding you in here. Feel free to unmute and share. Apologies if I'm putting you on the spot.
Oh, it's okay. I actually raised my hand by accident, but I would like to say thank you so much for everything that all of you are doing. And I agree with everybody's points. And also just one really interesting thing that I thought of, in terms of the med students sorting the trash. There's a great article called Dumpster Diving in the ED by Dr. Slutzman, and he talks a lot about you know, the enormous waste produced by our facilities, and you know, and connects that to how much carbon pollution we're producing, and possible solutions. So, but sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand, but thank you again so much for everything.
No, thank you. And would anybody else, I mean, if you want to raise your hand, that allows us to allow you to talk and unmute yourself. So are there any comments from the audience or kind of questions, reactions? Here you go. Let's see. Navneet.
Yes, thank you so much for a very, very hopeful and encouraging panel. I've already told Dr. Sack about my appreciation for his input. So thankful to Ellen for coming, speaking from South Africa. I totally identify with your experience and what you mentioned as a political problem. I have an NGO in India that is trying to work on eco-destruction, plastic pollution, with great resistance and almost physical threats from different organizations. I am encouraged, but this, and I want to just, this is a comment for Karen and Todd, and I believe Dr. Epstein, I forget his name, who's left, Edelstein, I believe, who I could not talk to. Thank you. So this remains an ivory tower in America. It totally does. I worked in 6 different states in hospital medicine. Now I'm working in outpatient medicine in California. We don't have recycling bins in physician lounges in 80% of hospitals in Philadelphia. And if they're there, doctors are not using them. So the illiteracy is immense. And I was so encouraged and skeptical about that 60% number that Todd, you quoted on how many healthcare professionals, was it doctors who want to make a change? Not in America, 60%. I mean, this is just as an ivory tower of thinking. And I'm so glad eventually it'll percolate, but it is not mainstream in the healthcare profession. And I dread speaking with Lauren, my CEO, this afternoon when I get to the office. I am including this in the huddle, and I'm going to, you know, you're my green doctor. You've helped me overcome despair, but I'm very skeptical. This is still an ivory tower kind of thinking. So glad Lauren's generation, of course, I'm middle-aged. Lauren's generation gives me hope. There was a talk on the social medicine podcast by this doctor called Harleen Marwa, who started a campaign, I think the World Medical Association. She had the grand success of gathering 100 students worldwide, and that was a couple of years ago, to support her cause of climate action. But then Karen's slide on the journal, I didn't even know there's a journal on health, climate equity, or whatever that was. I've noted it here. The residents working towards it. It's a very long comment, but America is failing. Of course, we are the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases, but also failing. The healthcare profession has so far failed in the climate action movement completely.
Yeah, Naveen, I appreciate those comments. My recommendation is twofold. One is try to appeal to people's pocketbooks when you speak to managers. They really can save money by doing these things, whether you're an institution or a clinic or an individual at your home, by taking energy and water and chemicals and reusing these sort of topics seriously. So appeal to the pocketbook to get them started, but also make it across an institution as a goal of sustainability, not just one person in office or one person in clinic, but make this part of the core value of an institution, as important as providing excellent healthcare or respect for your colleagues or HIPAA compliance. Sustainability needs to be one of those core values, because you're right. If we wait for the doctors to do it, it'll never happen.
Yeah, and in fact, just to add to that, I know there's a movement to, have Medicare payments and such be dependent, have sustainability be a piece of that, and getting something like that through our system, is, I think you're very appropriately pointing to the ridiculous challenges in getting, things done that need to be done.
Let me give you one opportunity also for your professional societies and your organizations. The American Medical Association pledged to fossil fuel divestment. That was great. But more importantly, their pledge included requiring each of the vendors they work with to demonstrate their own sustainability plan. So whether it's a vendor who provides materials to the American Medical Association, or where they go to have their annual meetings, they require a sustainability plan. So that's how we can have an influence beyond our own proprietary clinic or hospital. Make sure your vendors are held responsible in their packaging and their recyclability, in their own sustainability plans. And that you can do. It's easy.
I am very impressed again, Todd, with your all the work you've done with the website and the pledges and the certificates. I cannot wait to start. You've given me much hope today, and Karen has given me much hope in the how she's encouraging op-eds, and I'm hoping to see more in the NEJM. I'm hoping
no,
to see
and
more.
I want to say, now you raised that, and we're actually quite focused on that now. So I think we were slow. The Lancet, I have to say, was sort of covering a lot of this when we were covering it, but not as much. And there's a real commitment to a lot more content. And if you look, we have a climate, and health page. We make all of our climate content free for everybody. As I mentioned, and if those of you haven't seen it, it's worth looking at, because there was an editorial that was written across multiple journals. I think in the end, it was 200 and some odd journals signed on, that we all published together before COP. And one of the key points actually relates to what Ellen raised, which was that, we have a responsibility to be, supporting low income and middle income, countries in making this transition, that we've made a lot of promises, around what we're going to do, and actually fulfilling those promises is what needs to happen.
Thank you, Karen. If you could just share the link, that'll be so appreciated.
Yeah,
and
let me
just one
pull it up. Yep.
Thank you so much. And you know what, Ellen, and last but not least, I want to tell you, I would love your contact information, because those of us working in LMICs need to be collaborative. There are not a lot of us, clearly, not enough of us. So I would love your contact information. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to share contact information, and I'd love to touch base. I think that the more kind of collaboration that we can build across continents, countries, the more impact we can have. So we'll definitely link up.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Navani. And I think John is next.
Yes, I posed a question in the Q&A, which I can address now. I was wondering if you have a poll of mothers and fathers about their present ranking of worries for their children. And if so, where does climate change rank, and where was your poll taken, such as which country, if it's within the United States, is it national versus state? If it's state, which state? There's a difference between some states in the South versus some states on the East Coast versus local communities. And if there's no poll that you know about, where do you think parents would rank climate change in their ranking of their worries for their children?
Let me take a stab at that by saying, first of all, I don't think there's been a decent poll of that sort. The best was Andrew Lewandowski's poll published in Journal Climate Change and Health in August. And what he did is I mentioned this 45-second script. He delivered his 45-second script to about 280 patients, mostly children and their parents, during patient visits. And then he polled them anonymously. What do you think about this? Do you think this is good information for you to receive? And will you act on it in your lives? And overwhelmingly, his patients said this was good. They weren't offended that the health professional broached this topic as part of the visit. They liked it. They wanted more. And he actually asked people across the political spectrum, what are your political views? And he found that right-wingers or left-wingers or middle roaders, pretty much everyone was appreciative and wanted more. So yes, patients and their families in the pediatric office think this is important.
Well, Todd, I understand where you're coming from, and I appreciate your answer. But again, if you were not dealing with a poll presented as you say, and I'm going to ask Lauren this question as a medical student. If you devised a poll, where do you think parents would rank their worries? Would they put climate change as number one, or would they put climate change down the list? Would they be more worried about education for their children, putting food on the table, depending on where they live, their financial situation, especially with inflation as it is? Would they be worried about job security? Would they be worried about their kids getting sick, especially since we're still dealing with a pandemic? It seems to me that we have to operate in reality and not in a vacuum. What do you think, Lauren?
That's a great question. I'm actually a future pediatrician, so I really love that you'd ask
And I'm
that.
a retired pediatrician. Okay, I get it.
So it might be a little jaded, especially for 25 years old, but my concern is that parents aren't in my area in Jacksonville, Florida, in the Southeast.
Okay.
Parents aren't even concerned about COVID and aren't concerned about their child's vaccination status, which to me seems like a no-brainer. We have very clear cause and effect, very clear statistics of unvaccinated children with no prior comorbidities who are suffering from COVID, who are in the hospitals, who are unfortunately dying, and that's not getting across. So I don't know if a message recently that has been more in your face about like, this is a risk for you and your child. So my concern is that climate change, unfortunately, is one of those things where until it is affecting you personally and your house is destroyed by a hurricane, or your child has to move because of the asthma exacerbations, or you've completely lost your livelihood because the environment doesn't support it anymore, until enough of us actually start experiencing that, climate change isn't our problem yet. It's my generation's problem. It's going to be my kids' problem. So for me, that's really concerning, because if we can't even communicate things that are really happening right now and are very obvious, are very publicized, or you can't escape from the news about it, then how in the world are they supposed to prioritize things that are more, that are happening somewhere else? It's not us, it's not now, it's the future. And unfortunately, the steps that I think could prevent that, we needed to be taking them 10, 20 years ago, and we missed the ball. So now we're behind the 8 ball and we still aren't getting traction. And I think things like the climate accords and the Paris Climate Agreement, those things are important, but they should have been done decades ago. And the fact that we still can't get momentum there is very concerning. And I empathize with everybody as they feel concerned and scared about this and discouraged sometimes, because my fear is that parents don't rank this very high, that individuals don't rank this high. In the grand scheme of everything happening right now, I don't think it's the top priority, but it's something that is going to universally affect us one day. And that day isn't as far off as we think.
And I'm going to add to that. At my age of 69, I believe it's important to believe in something that's bigger than myself. And for me, that's all about future generations. I'm in my last decade or two of life. So for me, future generations is all about where it is as far as my concerns. I do think, as far as trying to influence present generations, I advocate for writing stories, and well-placed novels allow people to lower their defenses, to be more amenable to the real risk to the future generations, to come at them with non-fictional statistics, information, recommendations, so forth. People have their defenses and they will throw them up. And a lot of people will say what you want to hear, but when they get home, as far as what they do about it, that's a different matter.
John, I was going to say, I mean, I agree with you as well. And I think that, people have pressing issues, right? It's like, they can't afford homes and food.
Yeah.
And so this is clearly not going to rank high for a lot of parents. I think we should be taking care of people's basic needs so that then we could focus on this. But I would also say that I do think, again, this is not going to turn it into many people's highest priority, but I think when a kid is in the office, again, with an asthma flare, and simply saying like, wow, you know, the pollution in X area is really making this worse. And that's not your fault, right? That's something else. I think people making these connections to their children's health is potentially a very powerful motivator. Because I think it just gets overlooked and it, it's pretty critical. So, but I absolutely hear you. I mean, it's a rough situation.
Yeah, I agree with you, Karen, on that point. And certainly if it applies to somebody whose child had asthma and they're living in a location where the pollution is high, but you're asking for a political solution in that area. And the political solutions, from what we can tell, are probably going to come too late.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
John,
I do think individuals can make a difference. I read a study, and again, I don't know how accurate this can be, but if half the world put solar panels on their shelters, we would stop the amount of carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere. Again, I don't know how accurate that is, but it's just one thing that I read about. So I do think individuals can make a difference. And since we live in a capitalistic society where demand affects what people do, people can do things individually to affect what kind of demand there is, such as reducing their consumption, being advocates for conservation, using renewable energy such as electric vehicles, putting solar panels on their shelters if they can afford it, and plant-based diets. These are things that individuals can do. And if enough people do them, then that reduces demand for fossil fuels. And reducing demand for fossil fuels in, say, the next decade or two would have an effect on what the fossil fuel companies do, such as if we consume from companies that are using renewables rather than buying from companies that use fossil fuels, that affects demand as well.
Can I add? Sorry, Todd, go for it.
well, there's another resource on those polling information is from the Yale and George Mason University Climate Group. And if you just Google Yale Climate Survey, you can see very granular data asking the kind of questions, prioritizing climate with other priorities. And you'll see that for Democrats, it's in the top 5, and Republicans, it's in the bottom 20. But you can see very granularly by your congressional district, that kind of information. The positive news, for example, in Florida, very conservative, if you ask people, do you want your governor to take more action on climate change? 80% say yes, Republicans and Democrats. So there is some hope there in the data.
I just wanted to add that what happens in the US and other powerful countries and regions has a massive implication elsewhere. So, I mean, for a while it was under President Trump who was blocking changes happening in the global climate change negotiations. And just something like stopping fossil fuel financing has an impact on how African countries develop their energy resources. So the power of countries like the US is immense. And in a sense, that puts an additional responsibility on citizens of the US to force those changes and to force those decision makers to make those changes.
No, and I want to add to that. I mean, we obviously have a very, very powerful lobby of, fossil fuel companies and wealthy individuals who, support those industries. And so I think there's a lot of, it's very much like COVID, right? Like there's a lot of misinformation that gets circulated. And so we have a lot of people who are not, are not understanding at all what's happening because they're fed a lot of, false information. But I think you're 100% right.
Well, Ellen, I'll ask you this question. I don't know if you've been following politics in the United States, but when one of the Democrat senators is highly invested in fossil fuels and is blocking the Build Back Better bill, does that affect your hope for a political change in the United States?
Well,
And he's a Democrat.
No, for
Nominally.
sure. For sure. I mean, it's like Karen says, right? It's vested interests that are politicizing climate change action. It's vested interests that are benefiting from the status quo. And understanding what those vested interests are, calling those vested interests out is important, right? And it's not just in your part of the world. The same is true in my part of the world. There are massive vested interests in fossil fuels on the African continent too, linked to global interests. And I think that, I mean, Karen had mentioned it in her presentation about the gas lobby. In Africa, gas is the new Africa is the new frontier for gas. And you have international oil majors in Africa selling the dream of development and energy security. That's not a reality. We're not going to see energy provision. We're going to see exports and maybe a few revenues from exports. And unless we can offer an alternative, unless we can say, you can't go into Mozambique and go stop gas and that's it. You have to go, well, look at renewable energy, look at the jobs you could create, look at the localization potential, et cetera, and that will have power. So I don't know, John, to your question, I do think that we need to call those interests out, be it the senator, be it the president of whatever country, and we need to do it collectively as a global community.
Ellen,
Well,
have
do you
you
think?
found, oh, sorry,
Go
John.
Go ahead.
I was wondering, we talked about, parents, they'd probably prioritize this pretty low. I wonder if in countries like Africa where they are, or sorry, continents like Africa where there are several countries where they are feeling the effects of climate change, do you find that, everyday individuals are prioritizing climate health and are more concerned about it, and it's one of their top issues? Because here's it's very, as Todd was saying, very party dependent.
I think there's two kind of sides to this. I think that a lot of people are just sustainable in their practices because they have been forced to be sustainable, right? But in terms of prioritizing climate change as we understand it, no, for many of the same reasons that you guys had mentioned, people need to feed their children, people need to make sure that they can get to work. And unless we as the community can make those linkages clear and say, listen, food production is being affected on your smallholder farm because of these climate change impacts, then no, it's not a priority as we understand climate change or as we talk about climate change.
There's an old Bantu proverb that when the elephants fight, the grass is trampled. And I think many in Africa feel that they're just being trampled by these big European and American companies that are fighting with some constituents, but Africa will be trampled by this. And it's a sense of hopelessness. And we have to find ways to give people hope.
For you all, do you think that the solution is more in developing new technology? Is it in kind of reinvesting or shifting how we invest, or do you think it's kind of stopping some of the practices that are already in place?
I think that the technology is there, right? I mean, if we just look at the energy sector, we've got the technology. What is stopping us from rolling that out on scale, and who's blocking that? If I look at our work on the continent, again, it's about people want energy, people want development. So how do we ensure that we're not just importers of renewable energy technology, but that we're actually able to manufacture it, that we're actually able to create value chains and benefit from those value chains? And that takes tackling things like World Trade Organization rules or World Bank conditionalities. Or so my take is that the technology exists. We need to now create the enabling environment to allow us to leverage that technology.
Yeah, and two additional points. So one is that also those technologies are there and their costs are going down remarkably. So if you look at graphs, renewable energy, has gone like this now with Ukraine, fossil fuels. But I think the other piece though, and again, it was mentioned in the chat before, is I think we sort of, people feel compelled to assure people that they can continue to have everything they want and consume widely, and I think that's unsustainable. So I do think that there's an element of people really should be changing the way they live, but that's very hard for people to do, and it's not a message that people find very appealing.
John asked about ways we can advocate, and I wanted to raise three that health professionals can engage with. The first is the work that Karen's leading. Our professional journals really can influence our communities. And so I applaud Karen's work advocating at the New England Journal of Medicine and others who are writing articles for their professional societies. The second is professional societies themselves. There's an organization called the Medical Society Consortium on Climate Change and Health, which 48 of the largest health professional societies belong to. Those are societies, organizations like the AMA and American Academy of Pediatrics and others have delegated to the Medical Society Consortium to do the advocacy work. And I think that's a cop-out. We need to ask our organizations themselves to using their huge lobbying budgets to do some of that direct lobbying for climate and health themselves, not just delegating it to the Medical Society Consortium that does not have the resources of an AMA or an AAP and others to hire the expensive lobbyists to be in Congress. And then the third is that we as health professionals, nurses and doctors and others should join these advocacy organizations like Physicians for Social Responsibility that offer us the tools to do some of that lobbying work as individuals by joining a community organization.
I also love John's point earlier. I was actually talking about this in a group last night, and again, it was about COVID, but I feel like so many of these issues are related, and it was about, I mentioned how I felt like data had been weaponized by, in this country, data had been weaponized by the far right, I think, and where data used to belong to the scientific community, where we said, here, look at this data. Clearly, these trends are happening. Clearly, these are things to be worried about. And no one cared about the numbers. And then we kept pushing it. And so now they figured it out. And our adversaries have said, like, well, we have data, and it's whatever random study Google has shown them that agrees with their point. And so now our adversaries are using quote unquote data that's not necessarily scientifically validated or being published in the New England Journal of Medicine, but they're using these data and sharing those to say, like, no, clearly this isn't a thing. And so what I brought up in that meeting was, which is kind of going back to what John mentioned, is like, maybe we need to fight fire with fire. And they used to say, hey, we don't care about the numbers, we care about the stories. And it doesn't matter if you tell me that 99% effectiveness. If I know one person that it didn't work for, then I'm not going to listen to it. You can say that masks are X% effective, but I know one person who wore their mask and got sick, so I'm not going to listen to it. So I was like, what if we take back the piece of using anecdotes and telling those stories and sharing those, and say, you know what, okay, data didn't work and now you're using data against us. So what if we go back to sharing stories? And I don't know, that was just kind of a thought I'd brought up, but John had mentioned, the power of stories and the power of relatability. And I think in these issues, we've had the data for decades and it hasn't changed anything. We all see the graphs, we all know where it's going. And so I wonder if that's going to be how we actually get change. And I mean, it's funny when people say my generation, because I'm like, my generation, I'm considered a millennial, and I'm like, I don't know that we really are going to be the change. Hopefully we're helping pave a way, but I am very inspired. I don't understand them. I don't understand their TikToks, but I'm very inspired by this new generation. And Gen Z, I think they are really completely intolerable of companies and organizations that aren't aware of aren't socially aware or socially active. And so they inspire me.
to add to that, what Lauren said, on Monday, I was involved with a talk from the Academy of Pediatrics on this same forum about the idea that every child deserves to be nurtured. And they were looking at this on a global level. And the second part of the talk involved personal stories from people who were dealing with the issues of war or personal disease or personal mental health problems. Those 4 people that bravely came on and talked about their personal stories and experiences, that had much more effect on me as a retired professional than somebody getting up and speaking about the data or the scientific facts. So I agree, Lauren. I think going to personal stories, I think that's the way to advocate for what's going to happen. And even if we look at even science fiction, I know there are people, philosophers out there that we need to use more science fiction approaches to look at 100 to 200 years from now. Is the Earth going to be only 30% habitable in 200 years? I think we can talk about stories like that. And we know that stories have an effect on people for a lifetime. Just look at the Bible.
And I want to add, John, I think that the issue of personal stories, I think it's critical when talking to legislators, because I've done a certain amount of lobbying, and coming in and having a story about a patient, with West Nile virus, and we've had this change in vector-borne diseases, or again, we've talked about effects of air pollution or pollen or what have you. It's sort of describing something that you're seeing, and this person you're seeing who's a constituent is suffering. I think those, I think there's, pretty good evidence that those make a bigger dent than a lot of the other things we do.
This has been such a great discussion. Thank you, everybody, for participating. We're coming up on our time here. I was sure, I'm like, oh, people won't want to stay on, but I am so thrilled that people are engaged in this conversation and wanting to talk about it. Are there any kind of closing questions from the audience or from our panelists as we wrap up here?
I want to thank all of the people that I'm viewing right now for receiving my questions and interacting with me. And I very much appreciate that. Thank you.
And me too. This is Navneet. I just wanted to ask Asia why I cannot copy from the chat. It does not happen in other Zoom calls. That was my only technical question, and a big thank you to you guys.
I think that must be one of the settings because it's a meeting versus webinar. So I messaged our tech support, and I think that they're going to email everything out, and it should also be available because we recorded this, so it should be available on the registration page. I'll also see if I can figure out a way to I'll have all the presentation slides, all the contact information, any links that we discussed today, and I'll see if I can send that out to everybody as well. Sorry that the copy and paste is not working.
All right, so I apologize, I just want to hop in. I will save the chat for you. Lauren, if you just want to send me your email in the direct message, and I'll just send the chat right to your email.
Thank you.
No problem.
Lauren, from my side, I just want to thank you, Asia, the panelists, and everyone that's attended. I think that these conversations are so important, and I look forward to continuing the conversations with all of you and, yeah, fighting the cause.
Great.
Any other closing thoughts? Awesome. Panelists, if you don't mind, again, I think Ellen, if you want to drop your email in the chat so everyone can go ahead and have access to it. I'll make sure that we get all this information distributed to everyone. Thank you again, first of all, to our incredible panelists. They were so gracious in their time and energy and effort in actually getting this presentation together. And I could not have asked for more enthusiastic volunteers. Thank you to Asia and Cassidy for all the tech support and organizational support on the back end. Thank you also to CUGH for, actually making this a huge focus of the conference this year. I mean, that's in the name of the conference and a healthy planet. And so for giving us the space and this time, and the Trainee Advisory Committee as well, to really highlight these issues and let the trainees kind of push forward what we found really interesting and important. And thank you, of course, to our incredible audience. We would not be here if it weren't for the interest and if it weren't for everyone committed to bringing this back to their institutions. And we look forward to hearing how it goes. So hopefully we can all stay connected and meet up together at the next CUGH conference and talk about how it's going. Thank you all. Have a wonderful and safe rest of your weekends. And yeah, thank you so much.